Welcome back to Mindful Mondays. I am so excited to have this conversation. I think I'm always excited, but I'm so excited to have this conversation because one theme, not only during the season of Mindful Mondays that has been coming up, is boundaries. Yeah, boundaries, that B word that we are all so scared of because we don't know it. And the different conversations that we've been having with different individuals, that theme keeps coming up. That word keeps coming up. And I started thinking back to 2 years or maybe 3 years of my therapist telling me that we need to do 3 months or maybe 6 sessions of conversations around boundaries, because boundaries define us. Boundaries tell us where we start and where we end with people. Boundaries define us as people, but also they're a property line that protects us. And a lot of people, well, me, I didn't have any boundaries. Let me just say I had poor boundaries. And now that I'm getting older, I'm realizing how there's power in the word no, but no is the simplest boundary that we have, but a lot of us don't know how to say no. There's power in articulating what it is that you're feeling, but a lot of us don't know how to do that because we're so scared of hurting a loved one. We're so scared of hurting our friend. We're so scared of hurting our partners. We're so scared that if we speak, people will leave. And I'm realizing that with boundaries, those that are not meant to be within your property line and are not a safe space, maybe shouldn't be there. And over the course of not just Mindful Mondays, but of the last 2 years, I've just been going through a constant process of reinforcing my boundaries, learning words that I've never used before, but also understanding that if people are going to leave because I've got boundaries, then that's okay. So I decided to do something. After years of my therapist trying to have the conversation, would have 1 or 2 sessions and then, something else comes up. I decided to read a book that a friend of mine had recommended. So she was having a baby and she decided to have a child. And she was having a baby and she decided to have a child. She was having a baby and she decided to purchase this book. And she said it was the best thing that she ever did because she didn't have good boundaries or strong boundaries in place in order to impart to her child. So this is the book that I've been reading. This is the actual book that I've been reading, but it's so torn up, so I bought a new one just for the camera. And I'm gonna gift it to my friend who just had a baby. But this book has been eye-opening in so many ways, and I decided that I want to do a 3-part series on boundaries based on this book and other psychological professionals and psychiatric professionals and mental health professionals who will guide us through it, because there's some concepts here that I know that I'm not equipped enough to speak about, but I just wanted to start with the basics and things that I have loved from reading this book. There's 3 parts to it, so today we're going to be looking at part 1 and what boundaries are, essentially. For me, I grew up in an environment where my parents had me when they were very young, and I grew up in a village where we didn't really have boundaries. You could go to anyone's house, you could, I guess, speak to anyone anyhow, but most of the time the conversations were always coupled, this is in the environment, with outbursts instead of normal communication. They were always coupled with children not being able to really speak up about the things that they like and don't like because, it's modeled after respect. And culturally, it makes it very difficult, and even, I guess, religiously, to really speak as a young child. I'm going to speak from an African perspective, but as a young African child and say, no, I don't like this. Leave me alone. I don't want to play with this person. I don't want to eat this. I don't want to do that. And what was funny about reading this book, especially where the part about not wanting to eat this, it made an example of a child who refused to eat certain foods only for their parents to find out at a later stage that they were very allergic to those kinds of food. But I grew up in an environment where you speak when you're spoken to, and when you speak, you need to be so respectful that words like no are very foreign until you get older. And not that no is not a word that you don't know, but it's more when it comes to you and protecting yourself. We grew up with very poor boundaries, and our parents do try their best, but the truth is, I'm learning how to communicate in my 20s. I'm learning that when I am in a relationship, it is okay for me to express how I feel. And initially it was hard because you're always worried that the person you're with will leave. You're always worried that if you communicate this and that with a parent, you know, that you're always threatened with death, you know, like you can't speak to them like this, or else what if something happens to them? You couple boundaries with guilt. You couple boundaries with disobedience. You couple boundaries with disobeying God and your family. And this book has been eye-opening in so many ways because it made me realize that boundaries are okay, but also boundaries are a form of taking ownership over my life. Like every single day that I enforce my boundaries, I'm taking ownership of my life. And how people receive me or perceive me when I do enforce my boundaries is none of my business. Because ultimately, the life that I've led up until this point has been a life where I've had to do a lot of forgiving, you know, of myself. Like I've needed to forgive myself for the things that I've allowed in my life. How many of us have been in a position where there's so many things we allowed because we had poor boundaries, and all because we couldn't say no, all because we couldn't say I don't like this, all because we didn't tell someone to leave, all because we didn't leave when we were supposed to. And then you sit back and think of all the bad things you've had to endure, to some degree, the abuse you've had to endure, all because you just didn't have any boundaries. And now that you have them, there's also the transitioning phase, which we're going to discuss in other episodes, of like, what happens after you actually understand what boundaries are? The guilt that comes with it, whether people will stay, whether people will leave, whether you'll hurt someone. And unfortunately, we live in a world where having boundaries is seen as selfishness, you know. Having boundaries makes you a bad person, because when you do have, when you do have no boundaries or poor boundaries, everyone likes you, you know. You can't say no, you're the people pleaser, and people just walk all over you, you know. There've been times where I've done things for other people at my own detriment. And as I read this book, there's so many things that I realize that I am now in the process, I guess, of forgiving myself for the things that I didn't know. But that's the beauty of reading. That's the beauty of books like these, because they help us, I don't want to say reparent ourselves, but yes, reparent ourselves with better knowledge of the things that are needed to make us mentally fit. And this book goes through different phases of like using stories to define what boundaries are and what they're not, and showing what a boundaryless life looks like and the consequences of that. It actually made me remember a story from The Myth of Normal by Gabo Mate. I'm still going through the book, but about a man who didn't want to disappoint his wife and also didn't want to disappoint his mother. So he would have dinner at his mother's house and at home with his wife. And then eventually he died, all because he couldn't say no to one of them. And it makes me think of the many times where we've overextended ourselves or even overstretched ourselves, all because we couldn't say no. You know, like I see these memes all the time about like when someone cancels plans and you just get all excited. But the truth is, most of the time when we say yes to those plans, we know we didn't want to go in the first place. But then the thoughts of being relational beings and being out there and being accepted, I guess, makes us say yes sometimes to things that we know that we're not supposed to say yes to. There's an episode that I did where one of my guests had a guest that overstayed their welcome, and eventually she had to say something. But when she did, she felt so good. But when you're actually in the process of laying out your boundaries, when you're in the process of laying out the things that you don't like, it's a very uncomfortable experience. And I don't think enough people speak about it, because when my therapist initially introduced the concept of boundaries, she was like, no, just say no. And in my head, I'm just like, what do you mean I must say no? You know, that's not who I am. When she was speaking about family, and the things that I've allowed in my family that have led me to a point of, I guess, sadness and like almost wanting to detach, she spoke about how I allowed it, and how it's okay when you have boundaries, even with family. It doesn't make you a bad person. And then I said, what about religion? You know, you have families or family members that take so much from you and you can't say no. And she said, no, the issue with framing it or framing boundaries as a contradiction to I guess, how we are defined as people, whether we're good or bad, is that it doesn't really paint the full picture. So I brought in my religion, where the Bible speaks about how we need to give, but then she also gave me the other part of being a joyful giver. She said, if you're giving, be it money or of yourself, and you're not happy to do that, then you're not a joyful giver, and that doesn't actually make you a good person in the eyes of the Bible that you're trying to, live by. She said the Bible speaks of a joyful giver. So if you're giving of your time, if you're giving of yourself, if you're giving of your resources and you're not happy to give, that actually nullifies, I guess, your efforts, which you were doing, I guess, or like executing in order to be a good person. And that reshaped it for me. So what she said was, if you are going to give of your time or your funds, tell that person that this is how much I can give of myself, and this is the cap. And if that's the cap or the limit that makes you give joyfully, that's how much you should be giving. The point where it makes you unhappy is the point where you should not be giving that much of yourself. And I never really thought about it that way, but it actually helped improve a lot of my relationships, because I could really speak up for myself. I could really speak up and allow myself to say no when it was necessary and not feel guilty for it. And in the beginning, honestly, it's really, really hard. And as I was going through this book, I started reframing how boundaries are enemies of like our cultural and religious identities. I started reframing a lot of my childhood and how many things would have been avoided had I had boundaries, or had I been taught boundaries, had I been told that my voice and speaking up against the things that I like and don't like is also okay. I also learned that when people leave because you have boundaries, it's okay. They were never really meant to be in your life, because boundaries also requires you to respect other people's boundaries. And it's like a constant mirror every single day of checking in with yourself to see if you have, I guess, infringed on your own boundaries or infringed on other people's boundaries. And there's a lot about it that makes you realize that life is a series of choices. And the choices that you make can either empty your cup or fill your cup. But you can always keep your cup full if you pour out from an empty cup, but in a way that makes you feel like you have still protected yourself, in a way that you don't have to forgive yourself for later. And over the next 3 episodes, I'll be speaking to different psychologists and different mental health professionals around how we get over the fear of being shamed, the fear of being seen as bad or selfish, this fear of being of being classified as being unspiritual, or the fear of hurting other people's feelings, or the fear of abandonment should we enforce our boundaries, or the fear of punishment, or the fear of someone else's anger. And I know it's easier said than done in many of the environments that we exist in, but I just thought this was a really, really important subject to speak about, because a lot of us have sold ourselves short. A lot of us live very unhappy lives, all because we don't have boundaries, and all because we've been taught that boundaries are bad, with justification and I guess proof from things that we read every single day. And that's because we haven't really taken the time to investigate, to check if everything that we've been told is true, because without boundaries, it is impossible rather to be mentally fit. Thank you.